I've been doing some thinking in the last couple of years about the ethics of love, especially the second love command, love your neighbor as yourself, and thinking about the implications of that commandment for a range of issues, including the question, how ought we to treat the stranger in our midst? And so I want to share with you some thoughts, somewhat trepidatiously. These are contentious matters, but let's see what you think, and we'll see what God has for us. So, welcoming the stranger. In the Holocaust, the number of Jews who died in Europe at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators was around 6 million. The number of non-Jews living in Nazi-controlled areas during that time was about 300 million. The number of those who tried to help their Jewish friends and neighbors, or who actively spoke out against what was happening to their neighbors, was astonishingly small, less than 1/10 of 1%. I think it's one of the great tragedies of early 20th century European and American Christianity that so few Christians of that era took any kind of public stand against the persecution, deportation, and murder of millions of Jews. And that many Christians of that era were guilty of active complicity in the violence against Jews. It's one of the great tragedies, I think, of early 20th century Christianity. And a question that I think we have to wrestle with is why? Why did this happen? Why did so few people in that context stand up with their neighbors, their Jewish neighbors, to offer help? Why so few? And why did so few Christians speak out against what was going on? And I want to suggest that a large part of the explanation is that we humans are subject at the drop of a hat to groupthink, to thinking things are so because everyone around us says that they're so. Europeans and Americans of that era had embraced in large numbers a hate-filled, violent anti-Semitism that condoned treating people of Jewish descent as less than fully human. And this led them into what I want to call a kind of systemic moral blindness. Systemic moral blindness, widespread blindness, inability to see, egregiously wrong treatment of the members of some group, owing at least partly to the fact that the treatment in question is so utterly normal. Everyone does it, everyone accepts it, everyone thinks this way. Other examples of systemic moral blindness from the last couple centuries, so there's the violent anti-Semitism in Europe and the Americas, there's the chattel slavery in the Americas of the 16th through the 19th centuries, there's the post-Civil War Jim Crow laws, there's the practice of abortion on demand, and other cases come to mind. What I have been wondering is, are we in the grip of systemic moral blindness? Are we unable to see egregiously wrong treatment of the members of some people group because we're subject to a kind of groupthink? And more seriously, are we unwittingly enabling egregious wrongdoing against the members of some group by our silence or by some kind of active complicity? Now, if we were, it would be hard to know it in the nature of the case, because that's the way systemic moral blindness works. You have a hard time seeing when you're in the grip of it. But so I've been reflecting on the love teachings of Jesus in the last couple of years, and this has led me to worry that perhaps we are in the grip of a kind of systemic moral blindness as it pertains to our treatment of the stranger. And so let me try to motivate this with a parable. The parable comes from the University of Colorado philosopher Michael Huemer, who writes on the ethics of immigration and whose writing I've found helpful in various ways. So Marvin's crops have failed and his family is facing starvation. So he loads his handmade furniture into his truck and drives 200 miles to the nearest town to sell his wares at the town's marketplace. Sam, a regular at the marketplace, notices the stranger setting up his booth and inquires about it. On learning that Marvin will be selling furniture, Sam is upset. Sam's sons sell furniture in the marketplace, and Sam is worried that Marvin's booth will take away business from his sons. So he decides to act. Shotguns in hand, he and his sons confiscate Marvin's furniture and detain him in their basement for several months before dropping him off 1,000 miles away from his home. Marvin eventually makes it home to discover that his family has starved. Now, most of us, I take it, would think that this behavior is utterly egregious, totally inappropriate, totally morally abhorrent. And different moral theories would answer the question why this behavior is morally problematic in different ways. But from the standpoint of a Christian ethics rooted in Jesus' love teaching, and in particular rooted in the love neighbor commandment, so the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself, I think the reason that or rather the diagnosis of why it is that Sam's behavior in this parable is problematic is that it's a gross violation of the neighbor love commandment, the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. It's a pretty egregious failure to love one's neighbor as one loves oneself. And so I want to explore a bit that commandment, the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself, and look a little more closely at what it amounts to in order to investigate this further. So let's think a bit about the commandment, which I'll just call the neighbor love commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. And it's a big question what exactly the commandment means. Of course, the Greek here is agape. We're called to have agape toward the neighbor. But knowing that agape is the thing we're to have to the neighbor doesn't tell us much, because there's the question, what does agape come to in Jesus' teaching and in broader New Testament teaching about love? And I don't have time to offer a careful defense, so I'll just assert how I have come to think about this neighbor love commandment. And it has three parts: love your neighbor, that's the second part, and as yourself, that's the third part. So love your neighbor as yourself. And let me start with the first part, love. I've come to think, following the Christian philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff, who's writing on these things I found very helpful, I've come to think that there are two kinds of love at issue here in the neighbor love commandment. The first is what you might call attraction love. Attraction love is the love you have for something when you discern something beautiful about it and you're drawn to it. You're in its grip. You have a profound appreciation of it because of some beautiful feature you discern in it. And I think that there's an aspect of attraction love in the love neighbor commandment that especially as it occurs in the teachings of Jesus, that Jesus suggests that we are to have a profound appreciation for, indeed to stand in awe of, the neighbor's enormous worth as one beloved by God and created in his image. And so part of neighbor love is to have a profound sensitivity for the worth of the neighbor as one beloved by God and created in his image. And then a second component to the love on offer in the neighbor love command is what you might call benevolence love. And benevolence love is a matter of seeking the good, the well-being, the flourishing of the neighbor. It's a matter of seeking the neighbor's good, well-being, or flourishing. And it's a deep question how in the Christian scriptures the neighbor's good, well-being, or flourishing is conceived of. And here I'll suggest that the key to understanding the kind of good that we're to pursue for neighbor is to be found in the original context or the original setting in the Old Testament of the neighbor love commandment in Leviticus chapter 19. And there I think there's a good case to be made that the kind of good we're to pursue for the neighbor is shalom, or maybe more exactly, inclusion in shalom community. And shalom is a feature of a community, and you get really rich depiction of the idea of shalom all throughout the Old Testament. But it's the feature of a community when all in that community is going well. And what that looks like is that all in the community have their sustenance needs met, and all are safe against harms, against violence, against attack, against enslavement, and all are treated with dignity, and all have access to justice, and all are enmeshed in networks of caring relationship and more goods besides. And I want to suggest that as talk of love in Leviticus is framed, it's about pursuing the neighbor's shalom, or the neighbor's inclusion in shalom community. So that the second component of love then in the love neighbor command is this benevolence love that seeks the neighbor's shalom, his sustenance, his security, his dignity. Now, next, your neighbor. Who's the neighbor? And here I want to propose that the parable of the Good Samaritan is plausibly interpreted as suggesting that my neighbor is anyone in need and in reach of my care. That the usual boundaries that if you were a first century Jew, you might have thought separated you from neighbor would include religious boundaries, national boundaries, ethnic boundaries. Is this person a Roman? Is this person a member of a rival ethnic group, the Samaritans? And what Jesus seems to suggest in the parable of the Good Samaritan is that none of those boundaries matter, that your neighbor is literally anyone in need and in reach of your care. All of these boundaries that we draw between ourselves and others are morally irrelevant. And then finally, as yourself. What is the thrust of talk of as yourself in the commandment? And here I want to propose that what's at issue here is the following, that what we're being enjoined to do is to seek neighbor shalom as one would normally seek shalom for oneself. That it's a matter of putting pursuit of neighbor shalom on a par with pursuit of shalom for oneself. That's what it is to love one's neighbor as oneself. Okay, so pulling it all together then, here's what we get. The neighbor love commandment comes to this. Seek neighbor shalom, where your neighbor is anyone in need and in reach of your care, her sustenance, security, dignity, and so forth, with reverence for her enormous worth as one beloved by God and created in his image, putting pursuit of her shalom on a par with pursuit of your own. That's the love commandment. All right, so now return to the parable of Marvin and Sam, and now I think we're better placed to offer a diagnosis of where Sam went wrong. Where he went wrong, in short, was he failed to put Marvin's shalom on a par with his own. He was not seeking Marvin's shalom with the kind of priority he was seeking his own. Infliction of violent harm on someone who seeks merely to meet his sustenance needs by honest work and poses no threat of wrongful harm to anyone, in order to protect one's own economic interests, is, I want to suggest, a textbook case of not putting neighbor shalom on a par with one's own. To treat someone thus is to fail to love him as one loves oneself. It's to wrong him. And I should stress the latter point about wronging. In Romans 13, Paul suggests that the various commandments of the Decalogue are all of them summed up in the love command. And Paul says to the one who loves his neighbor does no wrong to him. And I think it's a plausible read of Paul there that the love command, as he was thinking of it, is functioning as a kind of summarizing of the morality of the Old Testament, at the heart of which, of course, were the commandments of the Decalogue. And so as Paul is thinking about things, the love commandment is a kind of summing up of what Jewish morality, or more simply, what morality requires. And so then the love command's diagnosis of where Sam goes wrong in his treatment of Marvin, I think, is that his treatment is not only unloving, but it's wrong. Now, the question is, does this parable carry over in the obvious way to our treatment of the stranger? And let's see. So here's a retelling of the parable in light of what's happening in not only our society, but societies all around the world. Marvin's crops have failed and his family is facing starvation. So he drives 200 miles to the nearest US town to sell his labor in the town's marketplace. Uncle Sam notices the stranger attempting to sell his labor and inquires about it. On learning that Marvin is an undocumented immigrant, Uncle Sam is upset. US citizens sell their labor in the marketplace, and Uncle Sam is worried that Marvin's labor will lower the wages of his citizens and raise the cost of their social welfare programs. So he decides to act. Shotguns in hand, Uncle Sam's agents confiscate Marvin's furniture and detain him in an ICE detention center for several months before dropping him off 1,000 miles away from his home. Marvin eventually makes it home to discover that his family has starved. Now, so same parable, just changing the bolded parts of it. And I want to suggest that this sort of thing, in fact, happens with shocking frequency in our immigration enforcement practice. So each year, over 400,000 immigrants, asylum seekers, and in many cases victims of human trafficking are detained for months, sometimes years, and often less than humane conditions in immigration and customs enforcement ICE detention centers. Family separation. ICE records indicate that between 1998 and 2012, over 650,000 US-born children were separated from at least one deported parent. And then finally, deportation. Tens of thousands of deportees each year find themselves deported to countries which they left long ago, in which they have no meaningful support system, either don't speak the local language at all or speak it poorly, and have no means of supporting themselves. And the plight of these folks is dramatic. Many fall into homelessness, dire poverty, drug addiction, depression, suicide. It's a brutal situation, man. And so the question is there an interesting moral difference between what's going on here, what's going on in our society's treatment of these immigrants and asylum seekers, and the story of Sam and Marvin? Is there some morally relevant difference between the cases? And now this is not a straightforward question, but it looks to me like the answer is no. There isn't a straightforward moral difference between the cases. It looks like we and our government are failing to put pursuit of neighbor shalom on a par with pursuit of our own in treating neighbors thus. So, infliction of violent harm on people who seek merely to meet their sustenance needs by honest work and pose no threat of wrongful harm to anyone as a means of protection of our own economic interests, it looks like is a textbook case of our not putting these neighbors' shalom on a par with our own, not putting pursuit of their shalom on a par with pursuit of our own shalom. To treat them thus is to fail to love them as we love ourselves. It's to wrong them. And now, what I want to suggest then is that on the face of it, there are deep tensions between the neighbor treatment enjoined by the love command and our society's treatment of immigrants, asylum seekers, and their families. But on the face of it, there's a deep tension here. But I want to acknowledge, these are complex issues, and there's much to be said in response to what I've claimed. And so let me briefly consider two objections one might raise, and then I'll wrap up. So two reasons you might be suspicious of these claims. One is it's the law, and the other has to do with worries about terrorism. So the it's the law objection I have in mind goes like this. Immigrants subject to detention, family separation, and deportation have broken the law. Because they have broken the law, treatment of them in these ways is morally justified. So I think that's a fairly standard kind of thought about how to think about these things. It's all unfortunate and much to be regretted, but it is the law. And so let me try to loosen the grip of that intuition a little bit with another parable. So here we have the parable of Sam the mayor. So Marvin's crops have failed and his family is facing starvation. This part ought to sound familiar. So he loads his handmade furniture into his truck and drives 200 miles to the nearest town to sell his wares at the town's marketplace. Sam, a regular seller at the marketplace, worries that this will cut into his business. Luckily, he's the town mayor and can do something about it. He issues a mayoral edict prohibiting people from Marvin's town from selling furniture in the marketplace, then dispatches sheriffs to forcibly remove Marvin to a location some 1,000 miles away. Marvin eventually makes it home to discover that his family has starved. Now, I think most of us would think this is not a good way to go. This is not an appropriate way to behave. Why? Well, I think the diagnosis suggested by the love command would go something like this: enacting laws and enforcing them in such a way as to inflict serious harms on those who pose no threat of wrongful harm to anyone, in order to protect one's own economic interests, is a textbook case of not putting neighbor shalom on a par with our own. To treat someone thus is to fail to love them as we love ourselves. It's to wrong him. And at least initially, it looks like the same would be said in the case of immigration. That someone has broken a law is no moral justification for imposing hard treatment on him if it was morally inappropriate to enact such a law in the first place. If enacting such a law and enforcing it puts a community in violation of the love command, which, so I've been arguing anyway, our immigration laws and their enforcement do, then that someone is breaking that law is no moral justification for imposing hard treatment on them. Another kind of worry you might have is the worry about terrorism. So this comes from the Federation for American Immigration Reform, who say, while most illegal immigrants may come only to seek work and a better economic opportunity, their presence outside the law furnishes an opportunity for terrorists to blend into the same shadows while they target the American public for their terrorist crimes. And now we live in an era where there is widespread dissemination of various sorts of terrorism, radical Islamic terrorism and other kinds besides. And this is a real issue and has to be frankly acknowledged. This is a scary thing facing Western societies. But let me try to, well, there's various empirical things one could say in response to this sort of worry. One is, in the case of refugees, the number of refugees that have come into the United States in the last 50 years that have had any kind of trouble with the law for terrorist-related concerns is truly minuscule. It's hardly any. And so you might wonder whether the kind of violence that we're visiting on immigrants, asylum seekers, and their families, you might wonder whether it's proportionate to the danger we actually face as a society from terrorism. But that's a debate to be had. I want to raise a different kind of worry that's more philosophical, and again, I'll raise it in the form of a parable. So this is the parable of Sam and the liver transplant. 10 people await liver transplants, 9 of which will likely die before a liver becomes available. One is Sam's daughter. To increase her chances of survival, Sam forcibly detains the other 9 in his basement until after his daughter has had the transplant. Several die in captivity. Now, here again, I think most of us would think Sam's behavior is egregiously wrong. Why? Well, different moral theories will offer a different answer, but from the perspective of an ethics rooted in the love teachings of Jesus and in the neighbor love commandment in particular, I think the answer is that the problem here is that Sam has failed to love Marvin as he loves himself. Sam has failed to love these other people in need of liver transplant. He's failing to love them as much as he loves himself. So infliction of violent harm on those who pose no threat of wrongful harm to anyone in order to secure some interest of one's own, even a vital interest, for example, a life-saving liver transplant for a loved one, is a textbook case of not putting these neighbors' shalom on a par with one's own. It's a textbook case of failing to love these neighbors as one loves oneself. And I want to say that it looks to me like something similar holds in the case of immigration. That infliction of violent harm on immigrant peoples, the vast majority of whom seek merely to meet their sustenance needs by honest work and pose no threat of wrongful harm to anyone, in order to secure some interest of ours, even a vital interest, safety against terrorism, for example, is a textbook case of not putting these neighbors' shalom on a par with our own. It's a textbook case of failing to love these neighbors as we love ourselves. To treat them thus is to wrong them. And so, in closing, I want to suggest that there are deep tensions between Jesus' love teachings and our society's treatment of the stranger, of immigrants, asylum seekers, and their families. I also want to say that none of this is going to change anytime soon. We live in a global political context in which these kinds of practices are the norm, are utterly widespread. It hasn't always been that way. If you go back about 100 years, it would have looked quite different. But that's the situation we're in now. And so there's no, I think, hope of any of this going away. But what we evangelical Jesus followers need to decide, it seems to me, is how we will posture ourselves in a political context where this is an unchangeable reality. Will we support these practices? Will we ignore them? Or will we stand in love against them?
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.